Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one there is significant changes in the eastern section of the front line in favor of the Russians, where the Russians are doing a full frontal assault on the eastern defensive line of the Ukrainians near Pokrovsk, where they're attempting to open the road for Mirnorad and the main supply line of Pokrovsk to the east. The Russians also managed to advance in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region in the Chasiv Yar sector of the front line, in the Kupiansk section of the front line, and in the northern section of the Kharkiv region, both in the Vovchansk direction and in the northeastern incursion. The Ukrainians in turn managed to continue the advances in the western outskirts of the Russian Sumi incursion, where they managed to recapture another town in the Sumi region. Starting out in the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians made significant advances, gaining control over the forest lines and forest patches south of Mirne, a defensive position here north of Mykolaiivka, isolating Mykolaiivka from Novoekonomishne through the northern roads, as the Russians now have fire control over it. With the Russian foothold in the southern parts of Novoekonomishne, they also have fire control over the river crossing here, the bridge that crosses between Mykolaiivka and Novoekonomishne. With this, Mykolaiivka is now operationally encircled. The Russians also secured the northern bank of the reservoir, here west of Mirne. The Russians captured the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here west of Razina, and they managed to cross over the defensive line, gaining access to the coal mine here to the northwest of Novoekonomishne, cutting off the northern supply road towards Novoekonomishne, flanking the town in its entirety in the direction of the highway connecting Novoekonomishne with Mirnorad. At the same time, the Russians have gained their foothold over the past few days in the southern flank of Novoekonomishne. The Russians are now storming the town from the northern flank as well. Novoekonomishne is an extremely important town for the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, as it is the final one before Mirnorad. There is no other position between Novoekonomishne and Mirnorad, except for the few fortified positions in between the two towns, and the Russians are now working on gaining control over those, encircling the town, gaining control over which will allow them to have a bridgehead across the river line and a road towards Mirnorad directly from the east, with no defensive positions of the Ukrainians prepared in the area beyond that of Novoekonomishne. With those wide assaults taking place, with Russians also advancing west of Razina in the direction of Fedorivka, gaining a foothold within the town, with an additional pushes further north, gaining control over the majority of Novotsoretsk, leaving just a small part of a road here in the northern flank of the town, as well as a push gaining control of a large portion of the forest lines here to the northeast of Novotsoretsk, reaching additional parts of the defensive lines of the Ukrainians here to the northeast of Pokrovsk. The Russian objective may very well be to cut off the main supply line on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, which is hardly well defended any longer, bypassing the fighting in the western flank by driving up to the northern flank of Pokrovsk. The Russians are now extremely close to the operational encirclement of the city. The Ukrainians are currently making use of numerous road networks here to the northeast of Pokrovsk to resupply Mirnorad and Pokrovsk for the continued battle taking place. If the Russians are able to gain control over this portion here in the northern flank of Mirnorad, including towns of Chervony Liman, Rodinske, Sukhertske, and Satishok, they'll be able to cut off all of these roads, including the main highway in the northern flank. This will leave only the intersection here to the northwest of Pokrovsk, including the railway, the highway, and the off-road, smaller roads connected to Hryshina that will supply Pokrovsk on the northwestern flank of the city. This means with Russian drone coverage over the northwestern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians would be able to operationally encircle the city, leaving the Ukrainians in an extremely difficult position, and the Russians are now only about 7 kilometers from achieving exactly that. The Russians are also fighting over the towns of Fedorivka, gaining a foothold in the eastern outskirts of the town with control over the fortified position and the forest patches leading up to it. The town itself is fairly small. The Russians will likely push through it to gain full control over it, pass through the first patch area to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians, facing the eastern direction here to the south of the town and the southern direction here to the west of the town. It will also open up the road for the Russian push towards Setishak and then onwards towards Suretsk. The Russians will be moving through the forest patches, forest lines, and settlements until they reach the railway here to the north of Pokrovsk before moving on towards the highway further south in the direction of Rodinsk. Once they get access to the railway, they'll be able to make significant advances in the northern and western flanks of Pokrovsk here on the northern flank, completely bypassing the entire defensive lines of the Ukrainians to the northwest of Pokrovsk and gaining access to the rear of the Donetsk region, bypassing the Slavyansko-Sensinivka line and moving onwards further north, completely bypassing the city and cutting off the main supply routes. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians continue storming Mariinka from the east and from the north, taking the Ukrainians down to the southern outskirts of the town as fighting continues within it. The Russians are looking to gain full control of it to bypass the defensive lines of the Ukrainians in the direction of Voskresenka, Oleksandrogorod, and opening the roads here in the northern direction as well, in the direction of Rivka, Kletsova, and Selenia High, from their current positions across the Mokrieli river line. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians continued advances in the Chasiv Yar direction, where they managed to advance to the north of the city, gaining control over fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the canal, expanding self-control to the northern flank of the city. Gaining control of these fortified positions allows the Russians to start fighting over the fortifications in the direction of Novomarkove, Markove, and Maiske on the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, which are necessary for the operational encirclement of Kupiansk from the northern flank. Moving further north in the direction of the Serbis river line, the Russians have not made any developments in this area. However, in the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced on both the eastern and western banks of the Oskar river line. On the western bank of the Oskar river line, the Russians continue offensive operations north of Radkivka, where they're looking to bypass the positions of the Ukrainians by operationally encircling the remaining parts in the southern parts of Kendershivka, getting control over the main highway, opening the road for the settlements here in the northwest of Kupiansk and Kupiansk itself for a push towards the town, and the general positions of the Ukrainians here on the western bank of the Oskar river line, strengthening the supply routes of their forces from the Varishna to Kupiansk for further offensive operations towards the town. On the eastern bank of the Oskar river line, the Russians gain control of additional forest lines as they get closer to numerous fortified positions in the area. Further north, the Russians continue their new incursion across the border area as they push in the direction of Sebrubinka and Khachne. As we see with this located footage, the Ukrainians launch a counterattack towards the Russian positions using tanks, while the Russians are located in the forest lines, entrenching themselves for further pushes in the direction of the defensive lines of the Ukrainians and establishing a bridgehead across the border area. In the direction of Vovchansk, there was recently, at the end of last month, a push by the Russians to create a bridgehead across in the direction of Vovchansk, and now we see geolocated footage of additional attempts by the Russians in the forest patch areas. This indicates a general trend by the Russian forces attempting to gain a bridgehead across the Vovcha river line and into Vovchansk, the southern parts of the town, following their capture of the northern parts of it. In the Sumi region, the Ukrainians continued their counterattacks in the direction of Kinderasivka, gaining full control over the town. The Russians attempted to counterattack to free up their forces. However, the Ukrainians continued with heavy forces, pushing the Russians out, and therefore the Russian operation switched from a counterattack to freeing up the flanks for a Russian withdrawal. The Russians attempted a withdrawal under Ukrainian fire. This likely caused a lot of casualties under the Russian garrison of the town. However, some of them made it out, with the Ukrainians now gaining full control over the town. This is a use of the classic Russian tactic to operationally encircle a town before storming it head-on, to which the Ukrainians are usually the ones who have to flee under heavy fire while operationally encircled. But now the Ukrainians have used it on the Russians with great success, regaining control over the town. However, this also raises the question, why are the Ukrainians launching counterattacks in the Sumi region while the eastern flank of Pokrovsk is collapsing? The developments in the Pokrovsk direction is a complete disaster for the Ukrainians and can end with a collapse of the eastern flank of Pokrovsk. If the Russians are able to consolidate their positions in their defensive lines here east of Pokrovsk, gain access to Mirnarod, cut off the supply lines in the northern flank of the city. They would be operationally encircling one of the main logistical hubs of the Ukrainian forces in the Donetsk region. It will open up for further offensive operations by the Russians further north. If the Russians are able to capture the city of Pokrovsk by the end of the summer season, the roads to the north of Pokrovsk would also be open for further offensive operations by the Russian forces, cutting off additional supply lines to the Sloviansko-Sentinivka line and also flanking the entire defensive line from the western direction, gaining control over a large portion of the Donetsk region and entering into some of the main supply lines for the Ukrainians into the entirety of the Donetsk region. If the Russians are able to cut off supply lines such as Izium, Mariinka, and Pavlorad from the Donetsk region, then the Ukrainians would be hard-pressed to supply the amount of forces necessary to hold their defensive positions within the Donetsk region. Therefore, with these recent developments in the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, it is becoming even more likely that the Russians will be able to gain full control over the Donetsk region by the end of this year. The question now is, will the Ukrainians be able to establish a counterattack? Will the Russians be able to take advantage of the recent developments and continue to gain the best possible outcome of these operations? And how long will it take for these developments to take place before we can determine whether the Russians will be seeing much more success in the coming weeks, or if it will be a continuous slow grind? In either case, even the continuous slow grind is speeding up as the Russians operationally encircle large cities that will completely overshadow the battle for Bakhmut, and we are seeing it both with Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.